the first thing he learned about the media was that lies were inefficient. They left trails, required coordination, created risk. Truth was cleaner. All it needed was framing. He understood this before he ever held influence. Back when he still believed journalism was about revelation, it wasn't. It was about selection. What to include, what to omit, where to begin, when to stop. Those decisions shaped reality more effectively than fabrication ever could. He didn't start in front of a camera. He started behind headlines, editing rooms, morning meetings, whiteboards covered in angles, not facts. The question was never, is this true?
Varanasi Mata Waraso Asar Aitiu. La iPass or Awata de so Garki Honaftan Mao Kan. Tomara art better out.
He learned quickly that audiences didn't want accuracy. They wanted coherence. A story that made emotional sense. Beginning. Conflict. Resolution. Reality rarely offered that structure, so it was imposed. This wasn't malicious. It was professional. Deadlines didn't wait for nuance. Attention didn't reward ambiguity. Emotion moved faster than correction. He became very good at identifying emotional leverage. Which image would stick? Which quote would circulate? Which silence would be interpreted? He understood how outrage could be manufactured without inventing a single detail. All it took was emphasis. Repeat one fact often enough, and it becomes the whole story. Ignore another, and it disappears. People assumed intention behind coverage. There rarely was. What existed was incentive, clicks, shares, momentum. Outlets competed for relevance, not truth. Relevance required reaction. Reaction required emotion. And emotion required simplification. He told himself this was harmless, that serious people would read deeply, check sources, understand context. But most people didn't live in footnotes. They lived in headlines. He watched reputations rise and fall based on tone rather than evidence. A pause before a name, a skeptical adjective, a headline ending with a question mark. None of it false, all of it directional. He realized that the most powerful stories weren't the ones that accused. They were the ones that suggested. Suggestion invites participation. The audience completes the judgment themselves. That feels like agency. It isn't. It's guidance disguised as freedom. He began to see how easily perception could be nudged, how moral certainty could be manufactured without ever stating a position. The media didn't need to tell people what to think. It only needed to decide what they would think about. He believed he was informing the public. What he was really doing was training emotional reflexes. He didn't notice when the shift happened. One day, he was reporting reality. The next, he was anticipating reaction. That anticipation began shaping his choices before facts even arrived. He learned to predict which truths would survive publication and which would be buried under timing. And once you see that pattern, you can't unsee it. The most dangerous manipulation he discovered was not distortion, it was curation. Because curated truth still feels honest, and honesty is what makes it trusted. He didn't feel powerful, he felt responsible, until responsibility blurred into control. And control stopped feeling theoretical the moment someone's life changed because of a headline he approved. The shift was not announced. no memo, no meeting. It arrived quietly, through metrics. At first, numbers were just feedback, a way to measure reach. Then they became instruction. He noticed patterns forming. Stories that provoked anger traveled faster. Stories that complicated emotion slowed everything down. Nuance stalled momentum. Outrage accelerated it. This wasn't theory. It was visible in dashboards updated in real time. The algorithm did not care about intention. It cared about reaction. And reaction was emotional. He began to see how easily people could be positioned, not as individuals, as roles. Someone became a villain, not because of what they had done, but because their image fit a narrative arc. A photo that suggested arrogance. A quote that sounded detached. A silence that could be framed as evasion. None of it fabricated. All of it arranged. Victims were shaped the same way. Complex people flattened into symbols. Their contradictions removed for clarity. Audiences didn't want people. They wanted meaning. Villains to focus anger. Victims to justify it. The algorithm rewarded that clarity. It amplified content that resolved emotional tension quickly. And unresolved tension required time. Time reduced clicks. He began to understand something disturbing. Editors were no longer choosing stories. They were responding to signals. Signals trained by past engagement. The audience was shaping coverage, but only within the options presented. This feedback loop tightened. Stories that performed well were replicated. Angles that didn't were abandoned. The range of acceptable truth narrowed, not by censorship, by indifference. He tried to push back once, suggested a piece that added context, slowed judgment, introduced uncertainty. It underperformed. No one criticized him. They didn't need to. The numbers spoke clearly. That was the moment he understood. Truth was no longer competing with lies. It was competing with efficiency. And efficiency was winning. He noticed how quickly moral certainty could be produced. A headline leaned one way, a subheading reinforced it. A quote selected for tone rather than substance. By the time readers reached the end, they felt informed. They weren't. They were aligned. This alignment felt like insight. It wasn't. It was emotional coherence. He watched comment sections fill with certainty. People who had read half the article spoke with absolute confidence. The story had done its job. Not to explain, to position. He realized then that the media no longer needed to persuade. It needed to prime. Once primed, the audience completed the narrative themselves. And because they participated, they felt ownership. Ownership makes belief harder to undo. Corrections came later, if at all. By then, the emotional imprint had settled. No retraction could erase it. He began to feel uneasy, not because he doubted the facts, but because facts were becoming irrelevant to outcome. What mattered was timing, tone, sequence. Truth had become a tool, and tools, once optimized, are used. Consensus didn't arrive through agreement. It arrived through repetition. The same angle echoed across outlets. The same framing, adjusted slightly for tone. The same emphasis, recycled until it felt familiar. Familiarity created comfort. Comfort created trust. Trust became consensus. He watched it happen in real time. Not because editors coordinated, but because they responded to the same incentives. When one narrative performed well, others followed, not out of ideology, out of survival. Being late to a story meant losing relevance. Being out of alignment meant losing audience. So alignment happened organically, not imposed, optimized. Readers believed they were choosing information freely. They weren't. They were choosing between versions of the same framing, different headlines, identical emotional direction. This illusion of plurality was powerful. It created the sense of an informed public without the discomfort of true disagreement. He noticed how quickly dissenting perspectives were marginalized, not banned, buried, placed lower on the page, published at inconvenient times, framed as fringe, no censorship required. Attention did the work. He began to see how behavior shifted subtly. People didn't just change their opinions, they changed what they talked about, what they avoided, what felt acceptable to question. Language evolved. Certain phrases became signals, others became liabilities. Public conversation narrowed, not because people were silenced, but because they were guided. He saw how easily fear and moral urgency could be combined. A story framed as urgent discouraged skepticism. A story framed as moral discouraged nuance. Together, they created compliance, not obedience, participation. People shared content not to inform others, but to signal alignment. Sharing became identity, and identity is harder to revise than belief. That was the moment he understood the shift. He was no longer shaping what people thought. He was shaping how they acted, what they amplified, what they avoided, who they trusted. This realization unsettled him deeply. Influencing opinion felt abstract. Influencing behavior felt intimate. He thought about the people behind the metrics. How many decisions had been nudged? How many conversations redirected? How many reputations altered? Not through lies, through emphasis. He noticed how rarely anyone asked what else could be true. The story felt complete. Completion is dangerous. It closes curiosity. He tried to introduce friction, stories that resisted easy conclusions, headlines that asked genuine questions. They underperformed. Again, the algorithm didn't punish him. It ignored him. Indifference was more effective than rejection. He began to feel trapped in a system that rewarded clarity over accuracy and speed over reflection. The consensus he had helped create was not fragile. It was self-reinforcing. And once consensus forms, truth becomes disruptive. Disruption is costly. He was learning, slowly, that the media's greatest power was not persuasion. It was normalization. The damage did not arrive as backlash. It arrived as silence. A name stopped appearing. A voice disappeared from panels. An invitation was quietly withdrawn. At first, he didn't connect it to the story. That was the danger. The headline had done its work efficiently. It hadn't accused. It hadn't concluded. It had positioned. The person in question had not been destroyed publicly. They had been made inconvenient. Sponsors hesitated. Partners delayed. Friends became cautious. Nothing dramatic happened. Everything changed. He realized this only when an internal email circulated, a brief note from legal, no risk identified, no false statements, just a recommendation. Given current perception, we suggest reducing association. Perception. The word landed heavily. The story had not revealed wrongdoing. It had revealed tone, enough to trigger avoidance. He remembered approving the headline, not because it was unfair, but because it captured the moment. Now that moment had extended into a life. He watched the follow-up coverage carefully. There was none. The absence was complete. The story had done what it needed to do. No retraction was necessary. No clarification demanded. The public had moved on, carrying a quiet conclusion with them. He began to feel the weight of irreversibility. Media damage didn't need to be maintained. It only needed to be introduced. Once perception shifted, systems recalibrated automatically. He tried to imagine reversing it, publishing context, running an update, inviting the person to speak. None of it would land the same way. Corrections lacked emotion. Emotion had already settled. He realized then that he had crossed an invisible line. He had always told himself that stories informed decisions made elsewhere. Now he saw the truth. Stories were the decision. The market responded. Institutions adjusted. Lives redirected. No one needed to say, "This person is finished." The narrative had done it quietly. He felt a deep unease settle in his chest, not guilt, recognition. He had been part of a machine that punished ambiguity, and ambiguity had a human cost. He thought back to every time he had justified emphasis. It's accurate. It's relevant. It's timely. None of those words addressed consequence. Accuracy did not protect against harm. Relevance did not imply fairness. Timeliness did not equal responsibility. He began to see headlines differently now, not as information, as triggers, each one capable of moving unseen mechanisms. He wondered how many lives had been quietly altered by stories that felt harmless in isolation. He understood now why media power was rarely discussed honestly. Because it didn't look like power. It looked like storytelling. And storytelling had always been considered benign until it wasn't. He sat with the realization longer than he wanted to, that he could no longer pretend he was reporting reality. He was participating in it, and participation demanded accountability he had never been trained to carry. He tried to fix it quietly. Not a correction, not a retraction. Context. He believed that if the full picture appeared somewhere, not loudly, not defensively, the damage might soften. He proposed a follow-up piece. Balanced, careful, no accusations, no absolution, just nuance. The response was polite, supportive in tone, empty in substance. Interest has shifted. Timing isn't ideal. We don't want to reopen things. Shakathin reopening, as if truth were a wound best left untouched. He tried another approach. A long-form analysis. No headline bait, no emotional hook. It underperformed before it was even published. Editors didn't reject it. They deprioritized it. Placement mattered. So did timing. A story published late was a story that never existed. He realized then that repair required amplification. And amplification required emotion. The very tools that had caused the damage were the only ones capable of countering it. He refused to use them, not because he was noble, but because he understood the cost. Correcting loudly would reopen judgment, reignite speculation, reframe the person again. Even redemption would carry suspicion. Silence, he realized, was not neutral. It was protective of the system. He began to understand that media truth was not cumulative. It was sequential. The first impression defined the arc. Everything after was footnote. He thought about the person affected, how they would read the story, where they would see themselves framed, not accused, not defended, positioned. That positioning would follow them longer than facts. He understood then why public apologies often failed. They didn't restore trust. They reminded people of the accusation. Repair in media was asymmetrical. Damage traveled fast. Healing moved slowly, if at all. He began to feel a profound frustration, not at editors, not at algorithms, at the illusion he had lived inside. That truth was self-correcting. It wasn't. It was path-dependent. Once a path was set, deviating from it required force, and force was indistinguishable from manipulation. He saw the paradox clearly now. To fix what media had done, he would have to do more of it. He couldn't. That realization closed something inside him. He stopped proposing fixes, stopped chasing balance. He accepted that the damage he had helped enable could not be undone without creating more harm. That acceptance did not absolve him, but it clarified his next move. He could no longer participate in a system where correction required the same violence as distortion. The truth didn't need better framing, it needed restraint. And restraint had no place in a machine optimized for reaction. The question stopped being abstract. He could feel it tightening around every decision. Stay. And continue shaping reality through emphasis, knowing the damage would be distributed, invisible, deniable, or leave and surrender influence, knowing the system would continue without him, unchanged. Neither option felt clean. Staying felt complicit. Leaving felt cowardly. He noticed how often colleagues spoke about impact now, impact metrics, impact reach, impact strategy. No one spoke about consequence. Consequence implied responsibility. Impact implied success. The language had shifted without anyone acknowledging it. He began to imagine life outside the newsroom, not dramatically, not heroically, just quieter, no dashboards, no alerts, no urgency disguised as importance. The thought frightened him more than outrage ever had. Relevance had been his oxygen. Without it, who would he be? He realized how deeply his identity had fused with visibility. People listened to him, quoted him, deferred to his judgment. That deference had felt like trust. Now he saw it for what it was, leverage. And leverage, once surrendered, rarely returns. The fear of losing it surfaced in subtle ways. He delayed decisions, rationalized participation, told himself he could do more good from the inside. That argument sounded familiar. It was the same one he had used to justify every compromise. If I'm not here, someone worse will be. He tested that belief. He stepped back briefly, skipped meetings, stopped pushing angles. Nothing collapsed. Stories continued. Narratives formed. Headlines landed. The machine didn't notice his absence. That realization was humiliating and liberating. If his presence wasn't essential, then his departure wouldn't be catastrophic. The weight of responsibility shifted. He wasn't holding the system together. He was smoothing it, making it feel reasonable. That smoothing had been his real contribution. He began to understand the cost of that role. By making narratives coherent, he had made harm acceptable, not justified, normalized. This clarity did not bring relief. It brought resolve. He recognized that silence could no longer be passive. If he stayed silent while participating, he was complicit. If he stayed silent by leaving, he was refusing to add momentum. One silence fed the machine. The other resisted it. The distinction mattered. He didn't announce anything yet. He needed to sit with the fear of disappearance, to understand whether his discomfort came from conscience or from withdrawal. He realized something quietly devastating. The hardest part of leaving wasn't ethical. It was emotional. Letting go of being needed, of being heard, of mattering in public. That attachment had shaped his judgment far more than truth ever had. Once he saw it clearly, he couldn't unsee it. And once you see your own dependency on influence, continuing to wield it becomes impossible to justify. He didn't frame it as a resignation. That would have required explanation. He framed it as exhaustion, a slowing down, a need for distance. The newsroom accepted it easily, too easily. There were polite messages, brief acknowledgments. Take care. Doors always open. No one asked what had changed. In systems built on speed, reflection looks like fatigue. His departure didn't create a vacuum. It created a schedule adjustment. Someone else took over his responsibilities before the week ended. New angles appeared, different tone, same momentum. The machine absorbed the change without friction. That hurt more than opposition would have. Opposition would have meant he mattered. This felt like replaceability. He packed his desk quietly. Years of work condensed into a box. Notes that once felt urgent now read as obsolete. Headlines he had fought for no longer resonated. They belonged to another version of him. Outside the building, the city felt louder. Not because it had changed, but because he was no longer filtering it through narrative. He noticed details he had ignored for years. Conversations without context, events without framing. It felt disorienting. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't anticipating reaction. He wasn't thinking about angles. He wasn't editing reality in his head. This absence of mental mediation felt raw, unprotected. He realized how much of his perception had been shaped by anticipation. What would resonate? What would trend? What would provoke? Now, nothing required provocation. Life didn't ask to be shareable. That simplicity unsettled him. He found himself instinctively categorizing moments. This could be a story. That could be a headline. Then he stopped. There was no audience waiting, no algorithm to satisfy. The urge to translate experience into content was still there, but without output, it faded. Slowly, he began to feel something unfamiliar. Silence without consequence. Not strategic silence. Not imposed silence. Chosen. The absence of reaction didn't feel like failure. It felt like relief. He began to understand how deeply his nervous system had been wired to attention. Alerts had replaced intuition. Metrics had replaced meaning. Now days passed without being measured. This freedom felt unstable, as if it could be revoked at any moment. He resisted the temptation to check, to see what was trending, to see how stories were unfolding without him. That curiosity wasn't informational. It was dependency. He understood now that leaving wasn't a single act. It was a continuous refusal. Refusal to re-enter. Refusal to comment. Refusal to translate. Each refusal was small. Together, they formed a boundary. And boundaries, he was learning, were the only defense against a system that fed on attention. Life without framing felt unfinished. Events no longer arrived with conclusions attached. Moments didn't resolve into meaning on their own. At first, this unsettled him. He had spent years closing loops, providing interpretation, offering emotional landing points. Now, nothing landed. A conversation could end without clarity. A situation could remain ambiguous. The absence of narrative felt like failure. Then it began to feel like honesty. He noticed how quickly his mind tried to intervene, to summarize, to contextualize, to decide what something meant. He practiced resisting that impulse, letting things remain unresolved. This was harder than any editorial decision he had ever made. Ambiguity, he realized, wasn't confusing. It was uncomfortable, and discomfort had been precisely what his work had removed. He began to observe how rarely people tolerate not knowing, how quickly silence invites explanation. He recognized the same impulse in himself. The need to make sense before sense was actually available. Without headlines guiding perception, he saw events differently, not better, differently. He listened longer, judged slower. He stopped anticipating reaction. That anticipation had once been his professional reflex. Now it felt intrusive. He noticed how often he had mistaken anticipation for intelligence. Predicting response had felt like understanding. It wasn't. It was rehearsal. Without an audience, the rehearsal lost purpose. Moments no longer needed to be optimized. They could simply exist. This realization frightened him because optimization had given his life structure. Without it, time stretched. Days felt longer. Not emptier, more exposed. He began to fear irrelevance in a new way. Not public irrelevance, personal. If nothing he did was seen widely, did it still matter? That question lingered uncomfortably. Then, slowly, something shifted. He noticed that the absence of relevance also meant absence of pressure. No need to be timely. No need to react first. No need to have a position immediately. He could wait. Waiting felt radical. He realized how much anxiety had been generated by immediacy, being first, being sharp, being quotable. Without those demands, his thoughts slowed. Depth replaced speed. He began to appreciate experiences without asking what they proved. A conversation didn't need to be insightful. A moment didn't need to be symbolic. This simplicity was not dull. It was grounding. The fear of irrelevance softened. He saw that relevance had been a contract, attention in exchange for performance. Breaking that contract meant losing visibility. It also meant regaining autonomy. For the first time, he was not interpreting the world for others. He was encountering it for himself. That encounter felt unfamiliar and fragile, but it felt real. The framing returned before he noticed it. Not as a habit, as a reflex. A conversation overheard on the street. A headline glimpsed on a screen. A comment made casually at dinner. His mind moved ahead of itself. This will be interpreted as people will react by. The narrative will shift if. He stopped. The reflex embarrassed him. It was still there, waiting. Not because he wanted it, because it had been trained. Years of anticipation had carved deep grooves. Leaving the newsroom hadn't erased them. It had only quieted them. That night, a message arrived. Someone he hadn't spoken to in months, a former colleague. The tone was informal, almost friendly. Would love your take on something. Off the record. Just your perspective. There it was again. Perspective, the harmless word, the familiar opening. He felt the old response rise instinctively, the desire to be useful, to clarify, to influence just a little, not to shape the story, to improve it. He justified it quickly. It's private. It won't be quoted. It might prevent harm. He recognized the pattern immediately. This was how it always restarted. Not with ambition, with responsibility. He didn't answer right away. He sat with the discomfort. He noticed how his body reacted. A slight tightening, alertness, energy, relevance still triggered adrenaline. That realization unsettled him. It meant the addiction hadn't been to exposure. It had been to impact. Impact, even invisible, still fed the same circuitry. He asked himself a difficult question. If I speak now, am I helping, or am I reclaiming a role I said I was done with? There was no moral clarity in the answer, only honesty. He knew that any comment, however small, would reinsert him into the loop. Perspective would travel. Language would migrate. Tone would shift. And none of that would require his name. This was how influence survived exits. Through informal channels, private messages, unattributed advice. He understood now that leaving attention systems was not about visibility. It was about refusal to participate in meaning-making at scale. That refusal required discipline, more than staying ever had. He typed a response, deleted it, typed another, shorter, deleted that too. The act of not responding felt heavier than any editorial decision he had ever made. Silence, in this context, was not absence, it was resistance. He finally replied with something simple. I'm not the right person anymore. No explanation, no justification. The message was seen, no reply came back. The thread ended. He sat with the quiet that followed. It didn't feel triumphant. It felt clean. He realized something subtle then. The framing reflex might never disappear, but he could choose whether to act on it. And that choice, repeated over time, was shaping a different kind of identity. Not the one who explained the world, but the one who allowed it to remain open. That openness felt risky, unfinished, but it also felt like the only honest way forward. The loss arrived quietly, disguised as calm. There was no dramatic withdrawal, no craving to be seen, just a subtle emptiness where urgency used to live. He realized he was grieving something specific, not attention, not status, voice. The ability to intervene when something felt wrong, to shape the arc before it hardened, to slow judgment before it calcified. Silence removed that lever, and with it came helplessness. He noticed how often he encountered stories that felt incomplete, nuance missing, context flattened. His instinct was still there. This needs another angle, but there was no place to put it, no inbox waiting, no editor asking. The absence hurt in a way he hadn't anticipated. It wasn't ego, it was responsibility without outlet. He began to understand why people cling to platforms long past relevance, not because they crave praise, but because they fear watching harm unfold without being able to intervene. Power had once given him proximity to correction. Without it, correction felt impossible. This realization unsettled him deeply. He tried to redirect that impulse inward. Instead of intervening publicly, he practiced restraint privately. He stopped reacting immediately to information, stopped forming conclusions at first exposure. He let stories pass through him without solidifying into judgment. This felt unnatural. Media had trained him to resolve quickly. Resolution created authority. Without resolution, he felt exposed. He noticed how often people around him demanded certainty. What do you think? Who's right? Is this real? He answered differently now. I don't know yet. It's complicated. I haven't seen enough. These answers disappointed people. They expected clarity. He was learning to disappoint responsibly. That discomfort became part of his discipline. He realized that certainty had once been his product. Now, uncertainty was his contribution. This shift felt like moving against a current. But it also felt ethical. He began to notice something unexpected. People who stayed in the conversation longer started thinking differently too. Not convinced, slowed. Slowing was the opposite of virality, but it created space. He encountered younger journalists occasionally, bright, fast, certain. They spoke the language fluently. Engagement, reach, impact. He recognized himself in them, the same urgency, the same belief that clarity was service. He didn't lecture. He listened. When asked for advice, he hesitated. Advice had been his currency for years. Now, he chose his words carefully. Be aware of what your story finishes for people, he said once. What conclusion it hands them? They nodded politely. He knew most would learn only through experience. The system rewarded speed. Reflection slowed careers. He didn't resent them. He envied their innocence. He wondered how long it would take before one of them noticed the same fracture he had. The moment when a story stops being information and becomes an action. He understood now that media didn't just reflect reality. It rehearsed it. Prepared people emotionally for what they would later accept. That realization no longer filled him with anger, only sobriety. He had stepped out of the rehearsal, but the play continued. Time changed how the stories reached him. Not fewer stories, different ones. Without alerts and deadlines, information arrived indirectly, through conversations, through consequences. Someone mentioned losing a job after a scandal he remembered only vaguely. A family stopped speaking because of a headline neither side could fully explain. A policy was accepted quickly because the public had already been prepared to accept it. Prepared. That word stayed with him. He realized how rarely people noticed when they were being prepared. Preparation didn't feel coercive. It felt informative. That was the genius of it. Media rarely told people what to accept. It trained them to feel acceptance before the moment arrived. By the time reality landed, resistance felt irrational. He saw now how emotional rehearsal worked. A series of stories, gradual framing, escalating tone. Each piece alone seemed reasonable. Together, they shaped tolerance. He recognized the pattern everywhere. Crises that felt inevitable. decisions framed as necessary, outcomes described as unfortunate but unavoidable. He had once helped sequence those narratives. Now he watched them play out without his hands on the controls. This awareness created a new kind of exhaustion, not from urgency, from knowing how easily perception could be guided, knowing how difficult it was to interrupt once momentum formed. He felt powerless in a way he never had while influential. Powerlessness with insight was heavier than ignorance. He understood why people preferred certainty. Certainty relieved responsibility. Ambiguity demanded endurance. He learned to live with unfinished reactions. When something unsettled him, he didn't immediately seek language for it. He sat with the discomfort. This practice felt almost unnatural. Media had trained him to respond quickly, with framing, with explanation, with judgment. Now, he allowed reactions to remain internal. This didn't make him passive. It made him slower. Slowness revealed something important. Most outrage expired on its own, if not amplified. Without reinforcement, emotional spikes softened. He realized how often his work had extended outrage far beyond its natural lifespan. Attention had been oxygen. Without oxygen, flames died. He began to question how much harm had been sustained artificially. Not created, sustained. This realization was unsettling. It meant that silence, when chosen consciously, could reduce damage. But silence also meant surrendering influence. He accepted that trade. He stopped explaining himself to people who expected commentary. "I don't have a take," he said more often. At first, this confused them. Then it disappointed them. Then they stopped asking. That loss of expectation felt like shedding a skin. He was no longer the person people turned to make sense of things. That role had once defined him. Now, its absence defined a boundary. He began to understand something subtle. Media power didn't come from telling stories. It came from deciding which moments deserved stories at all. By stepping away, he had stopped assigning significance. That didn't change the world, but it changed his relationship to it. He was no longer accelerating judgment. He was witnessing. And witnessing without amplification was its own form of restraint. The silence began to acquire texture. At first, it had been empty, a removal. Now it was layered. Days without reaction developed rhythm. Weeks passed without interpretation attached to events. He noticed how often meaning had once arrived externally, from headlines, from consensus, from the tone of conversation. Without those cues, he had to decide for himself what mattered. This autonomy felt heavier than influence ever had. Influence outsourced judgment. Autonomy demanded it. He began to notice how many people around him still waited for permission to feel. A story would break, and before reacting, they checked how others reacted. The comment section before the conscience. He recognized that reflex. He had helped build it. This recognition did not come with shame. It came with responsibility, not to correct, but to refrain. He realized that stepping away from media power did not mean disengaging from reality. It meant engaging without amplification. He chose his words carefully in conversation now, not to persuade, to avoid accelerating. He learned how often restraint felt like absence to others, but absence was not emptiness. It was space. He adjusted to being unseen, not ignored, unconsulted. That distinction mattered. People no longer asked him to interpret events. They asked him how he was. This shift was subtle and profound. Without a public role, his private presence grew. He listened more than he spoke. Not strategically, naturally. He began to notice something unexpected. Conversations slowed around him, not dramatically, just enough. Without a definitive voice to conclude things, dialogue extended. Disagreement lingered without resolution. This discomfort used to scare him. Now it felt productive. He saw how quickly certainty had once ended thought, how closure had been mistaken for understanding. Living without closure felt unfinished, but honest. He began to see his past work more clearly, not as manipulation, but as compression. Complex reality compressed into digestible emotion. Compression had made the world manageable. It had also made it smaller. He accepted that he could not expand what had already been compressed, but he could refuse to compress further. That refusal became his quiet ethic. No posts, no commentary, no analysis delivered at speed. He lived with the knowledge that his silence would never be credited for harm avoided. It would never trend, never be measurable, but it would be consistent, and consistency, he realized, was the only antidote to a system addicted to reaction. He didn't feel redeemed. He felt aligned. And alignment, unlike approval, did not fluctuate with attention. He stopped expecting clarity to arrive. That expectation had been the last residue of his former life. Once he believed every story deserved an ending, a conclusion, a lesson. Now he understood that endings were a luxury. Most truths remained open, not because they were unresolved, but because resolution required authority. And authority was what he had walked away from. He no longer tried to correct narratives as they unfolded. He no longer tracked how perception shifted. Not out of indifference, but out of discipline. He had learned that attention was not neutral, that looking longer, reacting louder, explaining further, did not always serve understanding. Often, it fed distortion. He accepted that some harm would continue without his voice, not because silence was moral, but because speech had become transactional. Every word now entered a market that rewarded certainty, not care, speed, not depth, emotion, not responsibility. He had once been fluent in that language. Now he chose to forget it. That forgetting was not passive. It required daily refusal to comment, refusal to frame, refusal to reduce complexity into something shareable. He lived, knowing that many people would continue mistaking confidence for truth, that headlines would keep rehearsing reality until people accepted outcomes they never consciously chose. He knew because he had helped perfect that rehearsal. This knowledge did not make him superior. It made him cautious. He no longer believed that truth could be rescued by louder voices, or that better framing would undo damage. He believed something smaller now, that not everything needed to be accelerated, that not every moment deserved interpretation, that some restraint, though invisible, mattered. He accepted that he would never be credited for what he didn't amplify, that his absence would not be noticed, that the system would continue, refined and faster, without remembering his hesitation. And he accepted something else. That power rarely announces itself as control. It arrives as help, as clarification, as guidance. It convinces people they are choosing freely while quietly narrowing the options. That was the true cost he had come to understand, not misinformation, but manufactured certainty. He didn't reclaim his voice. He relinquished it. And in a world where everyone is invited to speak immediately, that relinquishment felt radical. He didn't fix the media. He didn't expose it. He didn't redeem himself. He simply stopped contributing to a machine that confused reaction with truth. That choice would never trend. It would never go viral. It would never be quoted, but it would remain intact. And in a system built on distortion at scale, integrity, he learned, was not about being heard. It was about knowing when silence did less harm